I want you to picture, just for a second, the world's most advanced supercomputer.
Right.
Like an artificial intelligence housed in this massive climate-controlled server farm somewhere, processing trillions of calculations every single second.
The really high-end stuff.
Exactly. And you feed it a simple colloquial sentence or, a human idiom, and often it still completely misses the nuance. It just stumbles.
It does. It happens all the time.
Now, I want you to contrast that billion-dollar machine with a toddler.
Oh, yeah.
A tiny human, maybe 4 years old, who is currently covered head to toe in spaghetti sauce, right? But they just flawlessly deployed a complex subordinate clause to explain to their parents exactly why they shouldn't have to go to bed.
It's incredible. It really is the ultimate David and Goliath story of cognitive science. I mean, when you think about it.
It's mind-blowing.
We watch toddlers pull off this daily miracle, and we just assume it's mundane because, well, everybody does it. We all did it.
Right, it's just growing up.
Exactly. But underneath that spaghetti-covered exterior is a biological computational engine that absolutely defies belief.
So welcome to this deep dive, because our mission today is to completely upend and challenge really everything you think you know about how we acquire language.
Everything.
We are going to look at the entire journey. So from that adorable, babbling baby phase all the way to the very real and honestly incredibly frustrating struggles you might be having right now as an adult trying to learn a second language.
Because understanding the mechanics of how we learn a language, it isn't just some abstract academic exercise. It's not just for linguists.
No, not at all.
It fundamentally alters how we view our own brains, how we construct our deeply held identities. And practically speaking, how you can actually approach learning any new skill today.
When you understand that hidden machinery behind the words you speak, you start to understand yourself on a much deeper level. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with this magic trick that every kid pulls off. Because if you really think about the environment they are learning in, it's not a pristine, perfectly curated classroom.
Oh, far from it.
It is, frankly, a total mess.
It's chaos. And the sheer chaos of the input is actually what makes the achievement so staggering. This brings us to a foundational concept in linguistics, which was famously championed by Noam Chomsky.
Okay.
It's known as the poverty of the stimulus.
The poverty of the stimulus. Right, because, well, think about a typical family dinner. You don't have adults speaking to children in perfectly enunciated, grammatically complete audiobook sentences.
No, people talk over each other constantly.
Yeah, there are false starts. We say and all the time. We drop verbs. The actual audio data the baby is receiving, the stimulus, is completely fragmented.
And the mathematical impossibility of it is really what drove Chomsky's theory. The language input that children receive is profoundly impoverished.
Impoverished, yeah.
It is entirely too incomplete, too chaotic, and just inconsistent to explain the incredibly rich, strictly regulated grammatical knowledge they end up possessing by age 4.
Wait, so mathematically they shouldn't be able to do it?
Exactly.
Oh, all right.
If a child were just a blank slate, like a passive tape recorder absorbing data, they would never, ever be able to deduce the deep structural rules of a language based solely on those messy fragments.
Because there are too many possibilities.
Right. There are literally infinite possible grammatical rules they could hypothesize from that chaotic data. And mathematically, they should almost certainly guess wrong most of the time.
But they don't guess wrong.
No.
They somehow extract the flawless underlying architecture of the language. So what is the biological mechanism doing the heavy lifting here?
Well, Chomsky argued that something physical in the brain must be constraining their hypothesis space. His proposed solution was universal grammar.
Universal grammar.
He posited that we have a biologically endowed genetic blueprint for human language. Essentially, babies are born with the fundamental scaffolding of syntax already wired into their neural architecture.
So they aren't learning from scratch.
No, they don't have to learn how to process language. They just need the messy input from their environment to act as a trigger.
A trigger. Okay.
Yeah, flipping certain biological switches to tell them which specific language they're supposed to be calibrating to.
I love that idea of flipping biological switches. It's like the brain comes pre-installed with this massive soundboard.
Yes, great analogy.
And hearing English or Swahili or Japanese just pushes the specific sliders up or down for that environment. Now, I know that specific theory of universal grammar is highly debated today,
Very debated, yes.
with a lot of modern linguists leaning toward usage-based theories. But it perfectly frames the sheer terrifying mystery of what a child is actually accomplishing.
It frames the scope of the problem beautifully.
But there is a biological catch to this magic trick, right? This hyperreceptive state, this switch-flipping phase, it has a very strict expiration date.
It does, and the expiration date is one of the most tragic and fascinating areas of cognitive science. This leads us to the critical period hypothesis.
Okay.
It was most influentially formalized by Eric Lenneberg back in 1967.
1967, okay.
He presented this compelling argument that there is a biologically defined temporal window of maximum neuroplasticity for language acquisition.
A window of maximum neuroplasticity.
Right, and this window opens around age 2 and begins to rapidly close right around puberty.
Just shuts down.
Yeah, once you pass puberty, the brain essentially reallocates its resources, and you lose that innate plasticity required for the automatic, effortless acquisition of native-like linguistic competence.
And the historical evidence for this is incredibly sobering. When we look at tragic cases of language deprivation, I mean, the most famous and just utterly heartbreaking one is the case of a girl known as Jeannie.
The Jeannie case is a profound tragedy, but it inadvertently became a cornerstone of linguistics.
Right.
She was a child, subjected to horrific abuse and isolation, utterly deprived of almost all human interaction and language input until she was finally discovered at age 13.
13 years old.
Yes. And at that point, researchers, linguists, psychologists, they worked with her intensively every single day for years trying to teach her English.
And from what I understand about the case, she did learn words, right? She wasn't entirely incapable of communication.
She did learn words. That distinction is vital. Jeannie could learn lexical items. She could memorize the word for apple or store.
Okay.
She could string together basic disjointed thoughts like applesauce by store.
Just the raw vocabulary.
Exactly. But the deep structure, the syntax, the use of passive voice, the complex grammatical rules that string those words into a cohesive, flowing narrative that was permanently out of reach.
Oh, wow.
Despite her obvious intelligence and intense instruction, she never acquired normal grammatical competence. The biological window for syntax had irrevocably closed.
It's devastating on a human level, but scientifically, it paints such a vivid picture of the brain's energy budget. I often hear people use the metaphor of pouring concrete to explain the critical period.
Ah, yes, the concrete metaphor.
Like your brain is wet cement when you're a kid, and then it just dries and hardens after puberty. But I have to push back on that analogy.
Please do.
Because it implies you're just stuck, like permanently rigid. And I know adults, and I'm sure you do too, who moved to a new country at age 30 and learned Spanish or French and are entirely fluent.
Right.
So the brain can't just be a block of dry concrete.
That pushback is absolutely necessary because the concrete metaphor fails to capture the intricate neurology at play. The critical period is not a single monolithic iron gate that slams shut on your 13th birthday.
Okay, so it's not all or nothing.
Not at all. The research demonstrates that language isn't just one thing in the brain. It's a massive orchestration of different systems. And those different components have different sensitive periods.
Okay, let's map that out for the listener. Which specific neurological windows close and which ones remain open for business?
The sharpest, most biologically unforgiving window is for phonology.
Phonology, so the sounds.
Exactly. The physical production and perception of sounds, which dictates your accent. That window begins closing surprisingly early, often well before puberty.
Wait, really? Before puberty?
Yes. The motor cortex and the auditory processing centers become highly specialized for your native language very early on. If you start learning a language as an adult, the physical tuning required to produce a flawless, native-like accent is largely inaccessible.
That makes sense.
However, vocabulary and semantic mapping, that neurological real estate remains highly plastic and adaptable for your entire lifespan.
So an adult learner might always carry the acoustic signature of their first language, like they might always sound like a foreigner.
Right.
But they could theoretically build a vocabulary and a sophisticated, nuanced command of grammar that rivals or even exceeds someone born into that language.
The data supports that entirely. You can construct an extraordinarily complex, deeply rich linguistic system as an adult. It just might be delivered with a persistent accent. So the critical period is a biological reality, but it is highly selective in what it restricts.
Okay, so if babies have this magical, intensely plastic window where all the systems are fully open, what exactly are they doing during it?
They're working very hard.
We need to look at the actual chronological stages of baby brain development because, I mean, to the naked eye, they aren't studying. They're just throwing food and babbling.
And the outside observer, it looks like mere play. But underneath, it is a rigorous, hyper-efficient developmental sequence that has been mapped in extraordinary detail over the last 60 years.
And it starts early.
Very early. And the whole process actually begins with how we naturally alter our behavior around them.
Oh, motherese, or as the literature calls it, child-directed speech.
Yes.
I always find this fascinating because adults universally do this without any conscious thought. You see a baby and your entire vocal apparatus changes.
Completely changes.
Your pitch goes up 3 octaves, you stretch out your vowels, and you exaggerate your facial expressions. Like, look at the doggy, the cute doggy. We all turn into ridiculous caricatures.
It is an instinctive biological register that transcends culture, and is produced not just by parents, but by non-parents, and notably even by older siblings who are just children themselves.
Really? Kids do it too?
Yes. For a long time, the debate centered on its function. Many thought it merely served as an intentional mechanism, like infants are simply drawn to high, variable pitches, so it keeps them engaged.
But there has to be a deeper structural reason for it, right? We aren't just trying to entertain them.
The current understanding leans heavily into the concept of acoustic highlighting.
Acoustic highlighting, what is that?
When you elevate your pitch, slow your cadence, and stretch those vowels, you are practically scaffolding the phonological features of the language.
Oh, wow.
You are creating a high-contrast auditory map that helps the baby's developing brain identify where one word ends and another begins, which is a massive challenge in a continuous stream of speech.
Yeah, because we don't actually pause between words when we talk.
Exactly. Furthermore, motherese simplifies the structural complexity, presenting the baby with highly digestible repetitive syntactic patterns. You are intuitively serving them the exact linguistic data their brain is primed to parse.
And the babies take that highly curated input and progress through these incredibly predictable milestones.
First up is the babbling stage, right? Usually hitting around 6 to 12 months.
That's right.
And the biological mechanism here is just mind-blowing to me. When they first start babbling, they aren't just mimicking the language of their parents. They initially produce phones from all human languages.
The universal phonetic potential of an infant is staggering. A 6-month-old baby in Tokyo, a baby in New York, and a baby in Reykjavik sound virtually identical at the onset of babbling.
That is wild.
Their vocal tracts and brains possess the capacity to produce and distinguish the sounds of any language on Earth. But then, as the months progress, they undergo a process of profound specialization. They begin to actively narrow their repertoire. They start throwing away the sounds they don't need.
They do. And this is driven by a neurological process called synaptic pruning.
Synaptic pruning.
Yes. The infant brain overproduces neural connections. As they listen to the ambient language around them, the neural pathways corresponding to the sounds they hear are strengthened through use.
Use it or lose it.
Exactly. The sounds they don't hear. Those synaptic connections physically wither away to increase the brain's overall processing efficiency. They trade universal potential for localized mastery.
That brings us to around 12 months, where you get the one-word stage. It's just single lexical items, but they carry the weight of a full sentence.
Oh, absolutely.
Like a toddler points and says milk, but the holistic meaning is clearly, I demand that you bring me the milk immediately before I scream.
Yes, the holophrastic stage. By 18 to 24 months, we see the emergence of the two-word stage. This is a monumental cognitive leap because it marks the birth of primitive syntax.
More milk. Doggy run.
Exactly. They're beginning to manipulate the relationship between concepts. And then, following this phase, there's an absolute explosion of language. By age 3, the majority of children are effortlessly producing multi-clause sentences with remarkably accurate basic grammatical structures.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. The ultimate proof that they aren't just acting like little parrots, mimicking what they hear, is found in the highly specific, incredibly logical mistakes they start making. The goat and mouses phenomenon.
What's fascinating here is the psychological phenomenon known as overgeneralization. It is arguably the most instructive window into the developing mind.
Paint a picture for us.
Picture a child who has spent weeks correctly using the irregular past tense word went. They hear went, they say went. Then seemingly out of nowhere, they say, I go to the park. Or a child who flawlessly said mice yesterday is suddenly pointing to mouses.
And I've seen parents genuinely panic when this happens.
Oh, all the time.
They think their kid's brain is short-circuiting. They think, oh no, they're regressing. They used to know the word, and now they've forgotten it.
It creates the illusion of regression, but linguistically and neurologically, it is a massive evolutionary leap. This pattern is referred to as U-shaped development.
U-shaped, meaning their accuracy starts high because they're just memorizing the correct word, then dips down into a valley of incorrect usage before eventually climbing back up to the correct form.
The mechanism behind that dip is brilliant mental processing. When they enter that valley of incorrect usage, it proves they've stopped merely memorizing acoustic patterns.
They aren't just repeating anymore.
No.
Yeah.
Instead, their brain has actively induced a complex grammatical rule from the raw data of their environment. They have subconsciously deduced, to indicate an action happened in the past, I must attach an ed sound to the verb.
Okay.
And they begin applying that newly minted rule with rigorous, unyielding logic to every verb they encounter, entirely oblivious to the irregular exceptions.
So good isn't a failure of memory at all. It is a triumph of scientific deduction.
Beautifully said.
They are operating like little linguists, establishing a hypothesis and testing it across the board. I know researchers actually proved this with something called the WUG test, right?
The WUG test, yes.
Yeah.
Created by Jean Berko Gleason in 1958, it is a masterclass in experimental design.
Walk us through it.
She showed young children a drawing of a fictitious bird-like creature and told them, this is a WUG.
A WUG.
Then she showed them a picture of two of them and said, now there is another one. There are two of them. There are two. And she waited for the child to finish the sentence.
And the kids naturally supplied the word WUGs, complete with the correct plural Z sound at the end. Which is incredible because they had never heard the word WUG before in their lives.
Exactly.
They couldn't possibly be imitating a parent. They had to be actively applying an internalized abstract rule.
It proves definitively that language acquisition is rule induction, not simple mimicry. The child's brain is an active pattern-seeking engine.
Okay, so if babies naturally induce complex rules from massive amounts of messy input without ever trying to consciously study, why on earth do adults try to learn a second language by doing the exact opposite?
It is the great irony.
We trap ourselves in sterile classrooms, staring at whiteboards, desperately trying to memorize the rules first.
You've highlighted the great paradox of adult second language instruction. The mechanisms, constraints, and biological realities of second language acquisition in adults are profoundly different from a toddler's first language acquisition.
Vastly different.
Grasping this difference is the fundamental key to unlocking how we should actually be approaching language learning as adults.
So we have to talk about Stephen Krashen, because for anyone who has ever looked into language learning, his theories were an absolute earthquake that shook up the traditional classroom model.
Stephen Krashen introduced the monitor model in the late 1970s and 80s. It remains highly influential and naturally extensively debated in academic circles. The entire framework rests on a strict neurological distinction between two entirely separate processes, acquisition and learning.
Most of us use those words totally interchangeably, like I acquired French, I learned French. What is the actual cognitive difference?
In Krashen's model, the difference is night and day. Acquisition is a subconscious, implicit process. It is how you build deep linguistic competence through meaningful communicative exposure to the language.
Subconscious.
Yes. It leverages the brain's implicit memory systems, the same systems you use to balance on a bicycle. You can't necessarily explain the physics of riding the bike, you just do it.
Right.
Learning, conversely, is the explicit, highly conscious study of grammatical rules and linguistic forms. It's studying a textbook, memorizing conjugation tables, and analyzing sentence syntax.
So it's deliberate.
Very deliberate. Relies on explicit memory, like memorizing the capitals of European countries.
And Krashen's bombshell claim was that all that explicit textbook learning doesn't actually contribute to your ability to speak fluently.
That claim fundamentally altered language pedagogy. He posited that only subconscious acquisition leads to fluent, spontaneous, real-time language use. All that explicit, conscious learning of grammar rules, that only ever functions as a monitor.
A monitor. So like an internal editor sitting in your brain holding a red pen.
A very slow editor.
Yeah.
If you are sitting down to take a written grammar test, or you have 10 minutes to carefully draft an email in your second language, you have the cognitive time to consult your internal monitor.
You can think about the rules.
You can consciously recall the rule and check your work. But in a live, dynamic conversation, human speech moves far too quickly.
It really does.
The cognitive load is too immense to consciously apply grammar rules in real time while also trying to interpret meaning. Fluent speech must be driven by the fast, automatic, unconscious, acquired system.
Okay, if we accept that we cannot simply study our way to fluency, how do we trigger this unconscious acquisition? What is the actual mechanism?
The mechanism is what Krashen termed the input hypothesis. He argued that acquisition occurs in one way and one way, only through exposure to comprehensible input that is situated just slightly beyond your current level of linguistic competence.
Comprehensible input.
Yes, he codified this with the famous formula I+1.
I+1.
The I represents your current internal grammar system, and the +1 represents the new, slightly more advanced linguistic data.
I have always loved this concept because, to me, the mechanics of I+1 perfectly mirror video game design.
Oh, how so?
Think about it. If you are playing a game and the level is exactly matched to your current skill, so it's a breeze. You run through it without thinking, but your skills don't improve. You don't level up.
Right.
But if you boot up the game on day one and instantly try to fight the final boss, let's call it I+10, you are annihilated instantly.
Game over.
Exactly. The screen is a blur of incomprehensible attacks. You learn absolutely nothing because your brain is completely overwhelmed by the complexity.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the cognitive processing at play. Input perfectly matched to your level produces no acquisition, because the brain detects no gap in its knowledge. There's nothing new to integrate.
Right.
Input massively beyond your level just registers as auditory noise. The brain rejects it because it lacks the foundational scaffolding to attach the new information to.
So you are constantly hunting for that Goldilocks zone. The input has to be just hard enough that your brain has to stretch and use context clues to bridge the gap, but not so hard that the bridge collapses. That stretch is the +1.
The stretch is where neuroplasticity happens. It's the sweet spot of challenging yet comprehensible input. Krashen posited that if you simply submerge yourself in enough of this I+1 input, the brain's natural pattern recognition software will take over.
And it just happens automatically.
He argued the complex grammar and vast vocabulary will naturally fall into place without conscious effort.
But let's pause here because while Krashen's theory sounds wonderful, like just sit on the couch and watch Spanish Netflix for 1,000 hours and you'll be fluent, it feels a little too good to be true. And the scientific community didn't just accept this wholesale, did they?
They absolutely did not. The primary critique of Krashen's model is that it massively underweights the role of production actually using the language.
Okay.
This limitation was aggressively challenged by Meryl Swain, who introduced the output hypothesis. She argued that input is necessary, but it is fundamentally insufficient on its own.
So pouring data into the brain isn't enough. You have to force the brain to generate data.
Swain formulated her hypothesis after observing intense French immersion programs in Canada. These students received thousands of hours of highly comprehensible input.
Sounds ideal.
By all accounts, their listening comprehension was near native. They understood everything. But when researchers analyzed their speech, the students were still making basic, systemic grammatical errors. The massive input alone hadn't corrected their output. Swain deduced that the act of producing language, speaking, and writing triggers entirely distinct cognitive mechanisms that listening simply cannot activate.
Break that down for me. What is physically happening in my brain when I'm forced to speak that doesn't happen when I'm comfortably listening to a podcast?
When you are listening, your brain is engaged in semantic processing. You are hunting for meaning. Because you have context clues, facial expressions, and intonation, your brain can completely bypass complex grammar and still understand the message.
Right, I can get the gist.
But when you attempt to speak, you are forced into syntactic processing. You have to build the structural architecture of the sentence yourself.
From scratch.
Exactly. And in doing so, you are forced to notice the gap between what you want to express and what your internal linguistic system allows you to express.
Oh, anyone who's learned a language knows that exact feeling.
It's painful.
You start a sentence with total confidence, you're cruising along, and then suddenly, bam, you hit a structural wall. You realize you have no idea how to conjugate the verb into the conditional past tense.
And the psychological friction of hitting that wall is an incredibly powerful learning trigger. It primes your reticular activating system.
How does that help?
The next time you are listening to input and you hear that specific conditional verb form, it will jump out at you like a neon sign.
Yeah.
Your brain remembers the intense frustration of needing that exact tool and not possessing it.
So it makes the input more valuable.
Precisely. Furthermore, output forces automatization. The painful transition from slow, effortful, conscious translation in your head to rapid automatic speech requires the physical, motor neurological practice of moving your mouth and forming the words under real-time pressure.
So if comprehensible input and forced output are the twin indispensable engines of adult fluency, where does that leave the traditional grammar textbook? Are we saying all those conjugation drills are completely useless? Should you, the listener, just throw your grammar book out the window?
This brings us to the most fiercely debated million-dollar question in applied linguistics. Do you completely abandon explicit study in favor of immersion, or is there still a role for the rule book?
Let's cut through the debate. Where is the modern scientific consensus landing right now?
The prevailing consensus, heavily influenced by researchers like Rod Ellis and Michael Long, advocates for a nuanced both-and approach.
Okay, both and.
Explicit grammar instruction does have tangible value, but its utility is highly specific. It is particularly effective for low-saliency, complex grammatical structures that your brain might simply gloss over in natural input.
Give me an example of something my brain would gloss over, like a really bizarre, rare subjunctive clause.
Or even something as simple as the third-person singular ses in English saying he walks instead of he walks.
Oh, interesting.
In rapid speech, that sound is incredibly brief and acoustically weak. If you are just listening for meaning, your brain might never register its existence. Explicitly studying the rule acts as a spotlight. It accelerates your ability to notice it in the wild.
I see.
But, and this is a massive, crucial caveat, explicit instruction is neither necessary nor sufficient for achieving fluency.
Meaning, theoretically, you could reach fluency without ever opening a grammar book, but you are absolutely guaranteed to fail if the grammar book is the only thing you use.
Though the data is unequivocal on that. If you spend your time meticulously studying grammar rules, but fail to engage in extensive reading, listening, and speaking, you develop what linguists call accurate but halting language.
Accurate but halting.
You possess the explicit knowledge to construct a perfect sentence, but the cognitive load required to do so means it takes you 15 agonizing seconds to formulate a single thought. The conversation has moved on before you even open your mouth.
But let's look at the dark side of the opposite approach. If you just absorb massive amounts of input and you talk all the time, being super social,
Right.
but you completely ignore accuracy and never check the rules, what happens then?
Then you run headfirst into the phenomenon of fossilization. And this is a concept we need to explore deeply because it is the hidden trap that ensnares almost every adult learner who achieves conversational fluency.
Fossilization, just the word itself sounds permanent, rigid, and honestly a little terrifying for anyone trying to learn.
It represents the most painful reality of adult second language acquisition. The term was introduced by Larry Selenker in 1972.
What does it mean exactly?
Fossilization describes the neurological tendency for specific, systematic error patterns in an adult learner's speech to become permanently fixed. They become utterly resistant to correction, regardless of how much continued exposure or direct, explicit instruction the learner receives over the years.
To understand fossilization, we first have to understand what is actually hardening. Selenker called it an interlanguage, right? It's that messy middle ground. It's the unique, highly personalized version of the language your brain has constructed. It's no longer your native language, but it's certainly not a perfect native version of the new language either. It's a hybrid system.
The concept of interlanguage is brilliant because it reframes how we view mistakes. And interlanguage is not just random errors. It is a highly systematic, internally logical, but non-native linguistic system.
Okay.
Selenker's crucial observation was that, unlike a child learning their first language, the vast majority of adult learners never reach full native competence. Their interlanguage stabilizes. It fossilizes at a plateau somewhere below perfection, characterized by deeply ingrained, persistent errors.
Here's where it gets really interesting, especially from a biological perspective. Why does the brain just throw in the towel? Why does it accept these glaring errors as permanent?
It's all about efficiency.
I like to call this the coffee shop paradox. Imagine you walk into a bustling cafe in a foreign country. You are exhausted. You desperately want a latte.
We've all been there.
You approach the counter, you completely mangle the verb conjugation, your noun gender is wrong, and your accent is atrocious. But you manage to say the word coffee and point at the machine. The barista understands your intent, smiles, and hands you the latte.
And in that exact moment, your brain's reward circuitry registers a massive, unequivocal success.
Yes. Your brain floods with dopamine and says, mission accomplished. We successfully navigated the environment and acquired the calories.
Exactly.
The communicative goal was 100% met. So from a biological energy standpoint, why on earth would your brain expend precious, high-cost cognitive energy to go back and restructure the complex syntax of a transaction that already yielded the desired result?
You have just perfectly articulated the primary engine of fossilization,
Hmm.
the profound reduction of communicative pressure. Language is, at its core, a tool for communication. If your inner language is sufficient to make yourself understood, the evolutionary pressure to achieve grammatical perfection evaporates. The human brain is a fiercely efficient organ. It aggressively conserves energy. It refuses to do unnecessary computational work.
So ironically, being good enough to survive is actually the greatest enemy of becoming perfect.
It is the ultimate double-edged sword. Once an incorrect grammatical form successfully achieves a communicative goal repeatedly without causing a breakdown in understanding, the brain automates it.
It just hardwires it.
It shifts the processing from effortful, conscious assembly to automatic, habitual deployment. And once a flawed linguistic pattern is hardwired into your automatic production system, attempting to eradicate it through a grammar textbook is like trying to change the course of a river with a spoon.
Are there other neurological forces driving fossilization besides the coffee shop paradox?
A massive contributing factor is negative transfer from your first language.
Negative transfer.
The neural pathways dedicated to your native language are deep, incredibly fast, and heavily myelinated. When you try to produce a new language, those established pathways constantly try to hijack the process.
So your native tongue gets in the way.
It does. It inappropriately applies your native grammatical structures or phonetic rules to the new language. And as we discussed with the critical period, the motor neural pathways for accent production become rigidly specialized, which is why phonological fossilization is almost universally guaranteed in adults.
So the practical, real-world takeaway here isn't how to cure fossilization, it's how to prevent it. You have to catch these errors while the interlanguage is still malleable before they harden into permanent neural pathways.
That is the goal. You must cultivate a heightened attention to accuracy during the early and intermediate stages. You don't want to paralyze yourself with anxiety over mistakes, but you must maintain enough self-awareness to notice your errors and course correct before they become automatic habits.
Okay, so this brings us to the elephant in the room. We all face the same chaotic input. We all have to deal with the closing of those biological neuroplastic windows. We all run the exact same risks of the coffee shop paradox and fossilization.
Yes, we all share that biology.
Why then do some people seem to just effortlessly sail through language learning, while others hit a massive brick wall even when they are sitting in the exact same classroom receiving the exact same instruction?
This leads us into the realm of individual differences.
Yeah.
It is arguably the most practically relevant area of the science because it isolates the specific X factors that dictate a learner's speed, efficiency, and ultimate ceiling of success.
Okay, let's hear them.
We can divide these factors into cognitive hardware and psychological software. Let's start with the hardware language aptitude.
So we are admitting that some people are just genetically or neurologically wired to be better at this.
The empirical evidence is undeniable. John Carroll was a pioneer in this space developing the Modern Language Aptitude Test, or the MLOT.
What did that test show?
His research demonstrated that there are stable, intrinsic individual differences in specific cognitive domains that are highly predictive of language learning success. The MLAT doesn't measure general intelligence. It isolates language-specific hardware. For example, it measures phonemic coding ability.
What does that actually look like in the brain?
It is the raw auditory processing capacity to rapidly parse, distinguish, and hold on to entirely novel, unfamiliar acoustic signals.
Like processing gibberish?
Kind of. When a native English speaker hears Mandarin for the first time, to their auditory cortex, it sounds like an indistinguishable blur of tones. High phonemic coding ability allows the brain to instantly slice that blur into discrete, manageable phonetic units.
Wow.
The MLAT also measures inductive language learning ability, which is exactly what the WUG test demonstrated. It's the innate sensitivity to intuitively spot underlying grammatical patterns in a sea of chaotic data.
So some adults retain a high degree of that childhood pattern recognition software.
They do, and individuals who score highly on these specific aptitude metrics consistently acquire languages faster, particularly in highly structured, fast-paced instructional environments. But perhaps the most critical component of this cognitive hardware is working memory.
Working memory. Now, people often use the cliche of the brain's RAM to describe this, but I think that flattens the biology. How does working memory actually function when we are wrestling with a new language?
The RAM metaphor is too static. In cognitive psychology, we often refer to the Baddeley model, specifically the phonological loop.
The phonological loop.
Working memory is your brain's active, conscious workspace. It's the mental juggling space where you hold incoming acoustic information just long enough to manipulate it.
Right, because think about the cognitive gymnastics required to process a complex sentence in a language you barely know. You hear the first three words, and you have to hold their phonetic sounds in your phonological loop while your brain frantically searches its semantic database for the meaning,
Exactly.
all while the speaker is still talking and adding more words to the end of the sentence.
The cognitive load is staggering. If your working memory capacity is limited, the acoustic trace of the beginning of the sentence will physically decay and vanish from your mind before you have successfully processed the verb at the end of the sentence.
You literally lose the thread of the thought.
You do. Working memory capacity strongly correlates with the speed at which you can decode complex syntax and extract vocabulary meaning from context.
Okay, so aptitude and working memory represent the biological hardware. You kind of get what you get. But what about the psychological software? What about motivation?
Motivation is huge.
Because I have known incredibly smart people with massive working memory who enthusiastically start studying French, and they quit after 2 weeks. Clearly, hardware isn't everything.
Motivation is the great multiplier, but the research paints a picture far more nuanced than the simplistic folk idea of you just have to want it bad enough. In the early days of this research, Robert Gardner and Wallace Lambert identified something they called integrative motivation.
Integrative motivation.
They found this to be the single strongest psychological predictor of long-term success.
Integrative motivation, meaning the genuine desire to actually integrate into the culture. Learning Italian not because your boss told you to, but because you deeply love Italian cinema. You want to understand the humor and you want to sit at a cafe in Rome and feel like you belong.
Exactly that. It is the desire for cultural affiliation.
Mm-hmm.
However, as the world became more globalized, newer research, most notably championed by Bonnie Norton, fundamentally shifted the paradigm.
How so?
Norton argued that motivation is too shallow a concept. She refocused the field on the much deeper psychological constructs of identity and investment.
And this framework resonates so much more deeply with me because motivation feels incredibly fragile. Motivation is something you can lose on a rainy Tuesday morning when you slept poorly and you don't feel like opening your flashcard app.
Right, it fluctuates.
But identity isn't a mood. Identity is the structural core of who you believe you are in the world.
That is the crucial distinction. Norton argues that a learner's complex social identity, their understanding of their relationship to the world, their history, and their desired future, profoundly dictates how they will engage with the target language. It transcends simple motivation.
What does that shift from motivation to identity actually look like in the real world of learning?
It manifests as investment. A learner who genuinely feels that acquiring this new language aligns with the person they want to become will invest an immense amount of psychological capital.
They care more.
They will willingly embrace the vulnerability of looking foolish. They will speak up, they will make glaring errors, and they will endure the frustration because they view the language not as a school subject, but as a vital bridge to their future self.
But there is a dark side to this equation, isn't there? What happens if their identity clashes with the language?
The dark side is profound, and it explains why so many learners fail despite intense effort. If a learner feels that the target language represents a community or a power structure that actively excludes them, mocks their accent, or marginalizes their native culture, they will erect massive, invisible, identity-level barriers.
That's heartbreaking.
Standard motivation research completely misses this dynamic. You might have immense instrumental motivation, like you desperately need to pass the English exam to get a job to feed your family.
Right, the stakes are high.
But if the speakers of that language treat you as a second-class citizen, your biology will literally resist the acquisition process.
That makes total biological sense. If you feel threatened or marginalized, your amygdala triggers a stress response. Your brain floods with cortisol, which we know actively inhibits neuroplasticity and blocks access to the implicit memory systems needed for language. The language becomes coded as a threat, not a tool.
The affective filter slams shut. The input simply cannot penetrate to the acquisition centers of the brain. Learning a language is never just a cold cognitive exercise. It is an incredibly vulnerable act of identity construction and social negotiation.
Wow. Which naturally leads me to wonder when someone actually successfully navigates this gauntlet, when they master the hardware, embrace the identity, overcome fossilization, and become a true, fluent bilingual, What does that achievement actually do to the physical architecture of their brain?
It permanently alters it. The cognitive and neurological consequences of lifelong bilingualism have been one of the most intensely scrutinized areas of neuroscience over the last 2 decades. It brings us directly to the highly publicized debate over the bilingual advantage.
This was everywhere in the news a few years ago. There were endless articles claiming that teaching your toddler Mandarin would essentially turn them into a super genius with unparalleled focus.
The hype was immense, largely driven by the pioneering work of researcher Ellen Bialystok. She proposed a very logical biological mechanism. The lifelong, intense management of two competing linguistic systems acts as a constant, heavy-duty workout for the brain.
A brain workout.
Consider the neurology of a fluent bilingual. When they're speaking, both language systems are constantly active and competing for dominance in the brain.
It's like having two massive software programs running simultaneously, and your brain has to aggressively suppress the code for Spanish while you are trying to have a conversation in English, just so you don't accidentally spit out a Spanish noun to a monolingual English speaker.
The mental juggling is relentless. Bialystok theorized that this continuous unconscious need to select the correct language and suppress the irrelevant one actively trains and strengthens the brain's executive control system.
Executive control.
This is the network primarily located in the prefrontal cortex, responsible for selective attention, rapid task switching, and filtering out irrelevant distractions. Her early studies were explosive, suggesting that bilingual children and adults significantly outperformed monolinguals on complex, non-linguistic cognitive tasks that required intense executive control.
But the scientific community has really walked back those claims recently, hasn't it? The picture isn't quite as rosy.
The landscape has definitely shifted. The initial bilingual advantage hypothesis has proven to be incredibly fragile. As other labs attempted to replicate those early findings, many failed to find any significant effect, or found effects so minute they were practically irrelevant.
Oh, really?
Large-scale meta-analyses encompassing hundreds of studies have concluded that there is no consistent, generalized cognitive advantage to bilingualism. The current consensus is that if an executive control advantage does exist, it is highly modest, extraordinarily context-dependent, and absolutely not a guarantee of elevated general intelligence.
That makes biological sense. Just because you have massive biceps from lifting weights doesn't mean you can run a marathon. The brain's adaptations are specific.
Very specific.
But there is one highly specific bilingual behavior that often looks like confusion to outsiders, but actually represents an absolute masterclass in cognitive control and linguistic skill code switching.
Code switching is a fascinating linguistic phenomenon. It occurs when a bilingual individual seamlessly rapidly alternates between their two languages within a single conversation, often within a single sentence.
People judge that so harshly.
For decades, educators and the general public operated under the deeply flawed assumption that code switching was a sign of linguistic deficit.
Right.
They assumed the speaker was confused, lacking vocabulary in both languages, and was just sloppily mashing them together out of desperation.
I really want to clear up this misconception because the mechanics of code switching prove the exact opposite. Switching languages mid-sentence without violating the structural integrity of either language requires an insane amount of neurological gymnastics.
It is the ultimate display of linguistic virtuosity. It is a highly sophisticated, rigorously rule-governed communicative resource. When a fluent bilingual code switches, they are not breaking the grammatical rules. They are adhering to deeply internalized, complex constraints about exactly where, in a syntactic structure, a switch is mathematically permissible.
Right, you can't just drop a Spanish adjective into an English sentence wherever you want if the syntactical rules for adjective placement clash between the two languages. The brain has to calculate the structural equivalence in real time before allowing the switch.
The brain is actively monitoring both grammatical systems simultaneously, ensuring the transition is structurally flawless. They are deploying a combined linguistic repertoire that is vastly more complex than either monolingual system existing in isolation.
That's amazing.
It serves highly specific social, emotional, and expressive functions. Code switching is a feature of advanced mastery, not a bug of confusion.
Okay, so the general super genius intelligence boost might be overstated, but there is one massive, undeniable neurological benefit to bilingualism that we absolutely have to talk about because it affects the end of our lives.
If we connect all of this linguistic science to the broader picture of long-term brain health and aging, we arrive at perhaps the most robust, deeply important finding in the entire field of bilingualism research, the development of cognitive reserve.
This is the research centered around Alzheimer's disease and dementia.
It is. Across multiple studies spanning diverse populations and socioeconomic backgrounds around the globe, researchers have found a powerful association between lifelong bilingualism and a significant delay in the clinical onset of Alzheimer's disease symptoms.
A significant delay.
And we are not talking about a trivial statistical blip. The data suggests a delay averaging approximately 4 to 5 years.
4 to 5 years. Just to put that in perspective, billions of dollars have been poured into pharmaceutical research, and there is practically no drug on the market that can definitively delay the devastating cognitive decline of Alzheimer's by half a decade.
It's unparalleled.
How on earth does speaking two languages accomplish that?
It returns to the concept of the continuous mental workout, but viewed through the lens of structural neuroplasticity. The lifelong cognitive demand of managing two languages forces the brain to build what researchers term cognitive reserve.
Cognitive reserve.
It essentially builds denser, stronger, and more redundant neural networks and alternate pathways. As the physical pathology of Alzheimer's, the amyloid plaques and tau tangles, begins to physically degrade the brain tissue, a brain endowed with high cognitive reserve can physically compensate for that neurodegeneration for a much longer period.
So the physical disease is still there, the brain is still accumulating damage, but because the bilingual brain built a massive, complex network of alternate neural highways, it can just route the electrical signals around the damaged areas.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. The physical damage is present, but the tragic functional symptoms, the memory loss, the confusion, are delayed because the brain has alternative infrastructure to rely on.
That is just incredible. It speaks to the sheer, magnificent resilience of the human brain.
It is a testament to the fact that how we use our minds physically shapes the architecture of our brains until our very last days.
So, what does this all mean? We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've gone from cognitive science and baby babble to the nuances of Krashen's input hypotheses, the dangers of fossilization, and the neurobiology of brain health.
A very deep dive.
Let's distill all this incredible science into the ultimate, practical, real-world playbook for you, the listener. If you are in the trenches right now trying to master English or Spanish or Japanese, how do you apply this cognitive science to your routine today?
The very first step is a radical shift in your priorities and how you allocate your time. The science's clear, comprehensible input is not merely a fun supplement to your textbook studying. It is the primary engine of implicit acquisition. It is the absolute foundation of building a fluent, automatic linguistic system.
So the very act of listening to this deep dive right now, assuming the vocabulary and structure are challenging but comprehensible to you, is literally doing more to build your internal grammar system than sitting down and filling out a worksheet on verb conjugations.
Without question. Extended, meaningful exposure to the language at that I+1 level. Whether that is listening to engaging podcasts, reading books you actually enjoy, or watching compelling television produces vastly more neurological acquisition than an hour of rote grammar drills. You must flood the brain with input to build the unconscious system.
But rule 2 of the playbook, you cannot remain passive. You cannot just listen. You must aggressively embrace the psychological discomfort of output. Speaking isn't just a way to express what you already know. Speaking is the mechanism that forces you to learn what you don't know.
The output hypothesis demands it. When you avoid speaking because you are paralyzed by the fear of making a mistake, you are actively avoiding one of the most powerful neuroplastic triggers available to you.
You have to speak.
You must force output to notice your structural gaps, to prime your brain for future input, and to build the motor neurological pathways required for automaticity.
I always try to remind people that highly specific, agonizing feeling of discomfort when you are stumbling over a sentence, searching for a word, that isn't the feeling of failure. That is the literal, physical feeling of neuroplasticity. That is acquisition happening in real time.
That's a brilliant cognitive reframe.
Yeah.
The discomfort is the signal of growth. And intimately connected to that is Rule 3 of our playbook, own your interlanguage.
Expect the errors, anticipate them, and do not catastrophize them when they happen.
Your interlanguage is your highly systematic, entirely logical, intermediate linguistic system. It is tangible proof of your cognitive progress. The grammatical errors you make are not shameful moral failures. They are highly informative data points about how your brain is currently mapping the new system.
It's just data.
The goal is not instant perfection. The goal is to cultivate enough awareness to notice those errors, actively seek out the accurate forms in your massive input, and consciously correct them before the communicative pressure drops and they fossilize into permanent habits.
Which brings us to the final and quite possibly the most profound piece of the playbook. Claim the identity.
This is the critical psychological foundation upon which all the cognitive strategies rest. You have to interrogate your own beliefs and ask yourself, am I truly a speaker of this language?
That's a tough question for a lot of people.
Far too many adult learners treat the target language as an alien tool they are just renting temporarily. But the deep science of investment and identity suggests that you must aggressively claim the language as your own. You must integrate it into the core architecture of who you are.
It has to become part of you.
The learners who psychologically identify as speakers of the target language are the ones who engage more deeply, risk more vulnerability, and ultimately achieve a vastly higher ceiling of competence.
It's a mindset shift. Stop telling people, I am studying English. Start looking them in the eye and saying, I am an English speaker. It seems like a subtle semantic shift, but neurologically and psychologically, it completely alters your trajectory.
It dictates the level of psychological capital you are willing to invest. It turns the language from an external academic burden into an internal expression of self.
We have covered so much conceptual and biological ground today, and honestly, before we wrap up, we should all just pause and take a moment to celebrate the sheer breathtaking complexity of what our brains execute every single time we open our mouths.
It's easy to take for granted.
We take a formless, abstract thought, instantly translate it into a complex syntactical structure, coordinate dozens of tiny muscles in our throat, tongue, and mouth, and push vibrating air out into the physical world to perfectly plant that exact abstract thought into the mind of another human being. It is a literal magic.
And we execute it flawlessly, rapidly, and effortlessly every day. It is the defining, miraculous feature of our species.
Before we let you go, I want to leave you with a final, slightly provocative thought to mull over, something for you to explore and test out on your own that builds on everything we just discussed regarding identity and psychological investment.
Connect this back to Bonnie Norton's research on social identity. If truly acquiring a language requires taking on a deeply new identity, a fundamentally new way of engaging with a different culture and community, does achieving fluency actually endow you with a second personality?
Oh, I love that question.
When you switch from the deep neural pathways of your native language into the newly forged pathways of your second language, are you merely swapping out vocabulary? Or are you fundamentally shifting who you are in the world?
It makes you wonder.
Do you make slightly different moral decisions? Do you process emotions with a different cadence? Do you carry yourself differently? It is something you should actively observe and test within yourself the very next time you step fully into your second language.
It's a fascinating, almost philosophical question to ponder as you continue your journey. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep pushing your boundaries, keep questioning the process, and above all else, keep absorbing that comprehensible input. Catch you next time.